Injury.
Probably, yeah.
So we'll wait for Bev.
But Bev is, yeah, because of everybody.
Is Gail with her or something?
She's got a Sue Cross. And they were just getting on. I checked the door to see if they were coming.
Yeah. We're waiting for a couple of people out there who are coming in. We'll just be patient here for a minute or two, okay? And apparently there's been an accident on Whitefish Stage Road, and traffic is all backed up too. So, keep visiting. I think Bev is coming here, and we're gonna wait for her to arrive.
Well, that's good. Very nice. We want to put that chair. Well, of course.
Yeah.
I was going through things. I thought that you might be willing to use these note cards. My church that I attended in New York was an Episcopal church, and this was a print of the tapestry we had on the wall. And we had a large Armenian group, and it was in honor of them. They came to live there. And I thought there might be people that that would like one of these. I mean, as a note card.
How about it? Just us?
Yeah.
Julie and me? I'd have to fight her for them. Oh, I'm interested in looking at them and talking to you about them. You're sorting? You're sorting out. It's one of those late afternoons where you want to keep the coat on, jacket on, right? Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. And last week, it was warm, it was sunny, the sky was blue, and we were competing against that. Tonight, this afternoon, it's cold, it's rainy, and there are car accidents that apparently happen once in a while. Welcome to all of you. Glad you're here. We will follow basically the same format. I'll make a few comments by way of bridging into from last week into today. Steve Seelheimer also mentions to me that a lot of people are viewing online. So it's worth doing that, I think, and people can see each session by simply going to the church's webpage, and then there'll be a link there to YouTube or wherever, right, Steve?
That's correct.
Okay, good. So just be aware of that. It's worth doing it if people are accessing it that way. We meet tonight, and then we meet again next week, same time and same place. Last week, I mentioned to you that we're looking at two chapters in this book together as I see it. I identify them as kingdom builders. The first of those two chapters we covered last week, and it had to do with Jerry Falwell and his efforts in Lynchburg, Virginia, having to do with the church he started there, Thomas Road Church and Liberty University, and then if you recall, his son took over the university as president of the university following Jerry Sr.'s death, and how all of that came crashing down. That story is still playing itself out with regard to the university, I think. But the really significant point woven through that is the evolution of Jerry Falwell Sr. and that whole enterprise in Lynchburg that moved, religiously and politically speaking, from a separatist understanding of the relationship between the church, between Christianity, and the state. And over time, Jerry Falwell moved that separatism to almost complete overlap, where he was going to try to Christianize in his sense of what Christianity is, and declare war, cultural war, on the kind of perceived hedonism of sometimes called secular humanism. And if you just go back to the introduction to this, the sheet I handed out at the beginning, we learn how troubling that can be, both for the church or religion and the state, if they become so joined at the hip, so to speak, or overlapping. We then move to the second of these kingdom builders that I have drawn out of Tim Alberta's book, Greg Locke, and the Global Vision Bible Church, Juliet Mountain, Tennessee, where he set up shop. Now, I know those of you who have read that chapter or remember what we talked about last week, and we will talk about more tonight, about Greg Locke, you are just going to sit on the edge of your seat. Steve Seelheimer told me that Greg Locke is coming to speak in Missoula.
July 11th through 14th, there's only room for 250. So.
Now, that's probably not counting the tent out front. So, it's not that far from Juliet, Tennessee to Montana, I guess. Okay. You will recall last time where we kind of broke off with regard to the discussion of Greg Locke and that whole tent world, religious world that Greg Locke had constructed. This tent would hold 3,000 people, and there were guards there in camo and, their weapons available to protect anything that needed to be protected, or so they thought. And Greg Locke would go into his theological ranting and raving, and there was apparently a market for that. If you also recall, last week I mentioned that Tim Alberta had contacted Greg Locke more than once, as I understand it, to be interviewed. And he never heard anything back. And then, after several weeks or months went by, out of the blue, Greg Locke contacted him and invited him down for a conversation. Tim Alberta, as he tells the story, was more than a little bit apprehensive about the reception he would get and how this conversation would go. And much to his surprise, it didn't go that way at all. Greg Locke was filled with kind of self-doubt, and he is much more self-reflective than Tim Alberta had thought he might be. And they had a kind of wide-ranging conversation, And I could pull out certain excerpts from Alberta's book about this, but I won't just for the sake of time. All that having been said, Alberta is not necessarily set at peace because of that. In fact, he's more than a little bit troubled. And that's where I'd kind of like to pick this up tonight. If we looked at Jerry Falwell, that whole separatism business, now we see another dimension of this kingdom building and its way of functioning, at least in the case of Greg Lott. Alberta says, all of this, after this interview, perhaps I should have felt better, if not reassured. But as bizarre as all of this is, you could determine it was just kind of harmless. This strange mix of spiritual hyperbole on the one hand, run amok, and reflective rationality that Greg Lott shows at the same time. That while misguided, Tim Alberta says, it could simply be ignored perhaps. And he would think maybe just over time it will burn itself out. Well, maybe, or maybe not. Tim Alberta was not reassured at all. In fact, he says he felt worse about it. Why? Because Greg Lott, despite his serious side, had discovered there is a market for the irrational. A market for the irrational. Locke, he says, and I quote, came to appreciate that wrath is a business model, that crazy is a church growth strategy, that hating enemies is far more powerful, at least in the short term, than loving them. We may also add that there is a market for lies and mindlessness, both religiously and politically, that can be put on steroids with mass media. I think we touched on some of that last time. From Alberta's point of view, rather than being curbed and brought into the mainstream evangelical fold, Locke made the evangelical fold surrender to him and his model of church growth and marketing. You can see the issue here. As he says, it is much easier for many self-respecting evangelical Christians to live in denial about themselves, their pastors, and their churches, and to see the world global vision church as an outlier, while Locke crept silently and quietly into the fabric of the evangelical church, broadly speaking. These pastors are now expected to have a political voice. They're expected to have a political presence. They are to be more than mere church leaders, more than mere preachers, says Alberta. In this world, uncertainty is punished, weakness is wokeness, and wokeness is the wrong decision. And I'm never quite sure what wokeness means. As Alberta says, increasingly what congregants expect is less religious instruction rather than religious justification. Let me repeat that. In this world that has been folded into the sort of Greg Locke model, people sitting in the pews are less interested in religious instruction than they are in having their own views reinforced and justified. In this world, the clergy are expected to provide spiritual endorsement for their congregants' lives. And if they don't get it, they will leave. Plain and simple. At the end of that road, says Alberta, is institutional ruin. I mean, we could just think about this a bit. We all know, that running deeply through the Christian Bible, Old and New Testaments, there is a prophetic tradition of where the prophets speak and challenge the people for their behavior, for their failure to feed and care for the poor, the stranger, etc., etc., etc. And you can find it in different language and different words in the New Testament as well. Such as, you have done it to the least of these, you have done it to me. What happens when people, we, any of us, come and sit in the pews and simply want to have all of our views endorsed and justified, no matter how crazy they might be, how crazy I might think about some issue or another? You don't want to be challenged. And if you are challenged, the door is not far away. When marketing or church growth strategies or any other kinds of business and media models, for that matter, come to prevail in the church, I ask the question, what happens to the teachings of Jesus? Or what happens to the prophetic tradition, as I just said in Scripture? Or what happens to the role of clergy? I would be the first to say that part of a healthy church's identity in the 21st century, maybe any century, is to be, in part and dramatically, countercultural. In this group I'm meeting with in Columbia Falls, I made a very similar statement last week, and one of the people said, yes, I agree. But I think a lot of these evangelicals in the Locke way of thinking think they're being countercultural. And you're saying you want to be countercultural? And I said, exactly right. That's a brilliant point. So the question then is, what are we going to be countercultural for or about? And there I think you get into the whole business of the Jesus tradition, the Old Testament prophetic tradition. Now here I will speak as a Lutheran for just a moment. In fact, I've put these lectures together. Somebody may be unfortunate enough to hear them someday. But I think there are other tools, and it's not just Lutherans, it's other denominational people as well, have theologically that can come to bear on this. Namely, these dialectic relationships between law and gospel. Kingdom on the left, kingdom on the right. And you can go down the list. And those of us who come out of a tradition who see ourselves living in that both and world of tension can be prevented, perhaps, from going to certain kinds of extremes that are unhealthy. But you see, when we're looking at what kind of countercultural position we may want to take, it begs the question of how we acknowledge, again, the church from the American state or any other state and political entity. How do we engage the modern social issues of our time with compassion and, I would say, empathy for the neighbor? How do we do that? All these issues, in my view, require us to move beyond a kind of wooden biblical literalism or a wooden kind of fundamentalism. And there's nothing wrong or unfaithful about saying, I don't know. I'm not sure. But in a world of an enclave mentality, there is a problem with that because that world requires black and white thinking. At least in my view, as I look at it. And it does come back to, for Christians, to the way we read and interpret the Bible. Steve was just mentioning, in a different context, there are a whole lot of things that we confront in our world and we need to be attuned to and think about that the Bible doesn't say anything about. We have to discern in the world of the Bible how we're going to manifest what the Bible does talk about. Love of the neighbor, concern for the disadvantaged, and so on. And if we don't have compassion and if we don't have empathy, I think we're hard-pressed to even come close to the witness we do have in the New Testament and elsewhere. Many of you have seen I think I mentioned this before, but you've seen the movie Conclave. And now we've just lived that out for a week, the real conclave. And again, the dean who presides in the movie, this is, over the conclave, preaches his opening sermon to the other cardinals about the issue of certainty and doubt. He claims that certainty is the unforgivable sin, and doubt is essential to faith. And you've heard me say this before, and I say it again because I'm probably preaching to myself here. The healthy flip side of faith not only is doubt, but it is where we discover, I think, that truth. You're going to get sick and tired of hearing me say this, that truth in these theological and ethical matters need not always be singular, but plural. The sheer intensity of our belief, the sheer intensity of my own belief, provides no evidence of its truthfulness. Let me say that another way. I may believe something to be absolutely true, and I am very intense about it. That doesn't make it true simply because I am intense about it. I could be wrong. And when religion jumps the railroad tracks, bad things can happen, and not just to the religion, but to others who get caught up in the train wreck. Okay. My own certainty, and I speak to about myself. I'm starting to preach. I know, Carol, forgive me. I'm not trying to take over the pulpit here, but I feel strongly about these issues. And I think that the plurality of truth is not a step toward relativism in the way I understand it. In other words, anything goes. That's not where this ends up. It's an openness, a broadening of our intellectual horizons and mindset and our theology and the way we read the Bible and everything else that won't allow us to narrow things down, to circumscribe everything under the guise of truthfulness, but really it's simply narrow-mindedness, maybe. Okay, let me just pause here. If I keep going, I will start to preach. Ideas, thoughts that you may have before we make another transition here. Yes. Now, the O'Flynn's, I got that far today. Your first name, please.
Janet.
Janet.
I find a place where I heard this recently, and so if I think of it, I'll raise my hand again. But a story where someone was trying, it was the builders organization that builds bridges.
Oh, yeah, mm-hmm. Building bridges.
In our country. And a line that someone used when it looked like a conversation he was having with somebody he had just met was about to go off the cliff and become antagonistic. He said, "No, wait, stop. You don't have to be wrong for me to be right."
Yeah.
And it took the person.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that is right. That if what I believe is true, and it's the only truth, anybody who thinks about it differently must be wrong. Well put. I think that, and the image of bridges and all of that can be helpful as a way of thinking and visualizing these kinds of things.
Building a bridge is easier if the other person has any interest in it at all, and if they don't, it's hard.
Yeah. If she describes this movement of bridge building, and when you're visiting with somebody or you're trying to have a conversation with somebody, if the other person is at least open to the possibility of bridge building so that you can have a meaningful conversation, it's helpful. Too often, or more often than we would hope, that doesn't work out that way. And you can't build a bridge to nowhere. Although I think they did that in Alaska one time, didn't they?
Jim, there's a...
David?
Wallace Stevens is a mid-century, last century poet, sort of arrogant, erudite.
Say again.
Wallace Stevens.
Wallace Stevens.
Erudite, intellectual poet with his own particular problems. But he wrote this poem called On the Road Home. And the part of the poem says...
Can you hear this? I wrote On the Road Home, a poem.
It was when I said, there is no such thing as the truth, that the grapes seemed fatter, and the fox ran out of its hole.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole world opened up.
The whole world opened up. Yeah, yeah.
You know, Jim, I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the people that go to the church went there because they wanted to hear what was being offered there. They wanted to reaffirm their own beliefs.
They wanted to be endorsed, their beliefs endorsed, yeah.
But I have to say, that's why it's not why I come to Northridge. Maybe it's probably why I'm a Lutheran and I picked Northridge, because while I don't always agree with everything, the essence of what I am called to do in this world is part of the statement or the mission of this church. So I want to associate with a church that has a mission that means something to me.
Right, and I think that is an important point. People who sit in the pews of churches probably are there, in part anyway, because of the general parameters and vitality and thinking of that community. That is good. But it comes back to, I think, Sherry, what I was saying earlier, that it begs the question about that larger ethos and comfort level and community thinking and identity and so on and so forth. It comes back to that, but that always should be judged against some outside things, such as the narratives and stories of Jesus, for example. Is what we do in this place or any other Christian community really consistent with that narrative? Or consistent with a way of thinking about welcoming the stranger in the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament?
And how much do they do in-house as opposed to what they might do outside their house, their church?
Yes.
You know?
I mean, I think that's true as well. Didn't we just get in at Northridge, for the people here, Northridge, wasn't there just a survey that came out having to do with stewardship?
Yes.
And it didn't, as I filled it out, but it was asking another set of questions, as I recall. Do you belong to X, Y, or Z? Outside. Do you do X, Y, or Z? Outside. That's interesting, and that's good to know that kind of stuff. And we, in many churches, talk about coming here, receiving the blessing to go out into the world and into the workplaces and institutions and organizations that are out there to work. But you can, I think, come up with a theology, maybe born in the kind of apocalyptic tradition of certain kinds of reading of Revelation, for example, where you see the outside world as hostile. It is a struggle out there between good and evil. Now, I'm inclined to think, I haven't always thought this, in the journey of life, I think I have at times given up on the whole concept of evil. No, I think there are things that are evil. And I do think there are things that are good. Now, how are we going to judge that?
I'm not saying this is the answer to the question, but the answer to the question that I was told is that I am evil. The human heart is the root of all evil, exceedingly wicked, desperately wicked. And so the evil then becomes, you become targeting people as the evil and their inner self.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that when you look at every person around you as, you are evil, you are evil, you are evil, you are evil, it skews your perspective.
Yeah. There is a sense in which, at least through my frame of reference, human beings are this strange mix of stuff. Everything from Genesis 1, all 6 days, and it was good, it was good, it was good. But something is also amiss. Something is also amiss. It's when we decide that we and our kind are the ones that who are good, and everybody out there is bad. Sometimes, when there are things that go on that we don't understand, people are thinking this way or that way. We just need to shut up and listen to them once in a while. And it may be that they're struggling with all kinds of things that are not necessarily evil. And I think about human sexuality, for example. Those of us who spent a lot of time with college kids in the last 2-3 generations, we just need to sit and listen sometimes. Maybe in the military too, I don't know, but I know the first student who ever came into my office in the early 80s or whenever it was, I don't know about SBU, Steve, but he sat down and self-identified as gay. That was the first student who ever came into my office, and he wanted to have a conversation, and it tied into what he wanted to do a research paper on, and so on and so forth. And that, in my world, was an issue that only became more and more pronounced as time went on.
And how did you respond to him, Jim?
Well, the first thing,
Or
I don't...
I could ask, how would you have wanted to respond to him?
First of all, I mean, I was significantly evolved enough at that point, I think, Linda, that I knew the first thing to do was listen. And not provide quippy answers to his questions, his concerns, his identity, and so on and so forth. After that, acceptance.
To me, probably the verse that has been most helpful, and I can't tell you the address, although I think it's Paul, is love builds up.
Love builds up, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it gives you a way to look at things, and it gives you a way to respond.
Yeah. And I don't know, after the last session, Steve, maybe it was you, maybe it was somebody else, I don't recall, but the issue of respect came up. How we respect one another. Sometimes that's hard, but it is absolutely essential to respect.
How about when it comes to love?
Huh?
How does it go when it comes just to love? Respect?
Yeah, and it seems to me, in an ideal world, those two go together pretty close, right? Love and respect. Now, there are certain behaviors out and about or things going on that I don't particularly respect.
Because they're debasing.
They can be debasing, calling each other names and, right on down the list. Okay. I want to transition again to this other chapter, this next chapter, that I've entitled The Orthodox Monk Cyril Hoveran, Civil Religion and Political Religion. The point and counterpoint of American extremist religion and Russian religion in the time of Putin. When I first got to that, I saw that title. What does that have to do in this, Tim Alberta, what does that have to do with the topic here? I think those of you who have read it might see more clearly what it does have to do. And I'm going to stay a little bit closer to the text here, especially for the benefit of those of you who have not read it. But it really takes place at an international meeting in France that Tim Alberta attended, and where he met Cyril Hoveran, an Orthodox Christian monk who had formerly been the aide-de-camp to Russian Patriarch Kirill, leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. Though born in the Ukraine, there's something rather relevant about that, he had taught, that is, Hoveran had taught at a number of places throughout the world. As he describes it, when the opportunity came, he felt a duty to lend his talents to the Russian Mother Church, and so took the position in Moscow with the Patriarch. The current meeting took place in France after Putin and Russia had taken and annexed Crimea in 2014 and has now, of course, invaded Ukraine lock, stock, and barrel in 2022. As Hoveran estimates, 80% of Russians' Christianity is a cultural identity thing, rather than a typical religious thing. As Alberta states, quote, "Fortunately for the Kremlin, doctrinal conviction is not a precondition to religious tribalism." End quote. And as the historian Mara Kozelski has stated, quote, "Orthodox Christian nationalism has been on the rise in Russia from the collapse of the Soviet Union," end quote. Nonetheless, Hoveran was taken aback in 2007. He was working for the Patriarch, but he was taken aback when Vladimir Putin stated at a global security forum his desire to recreate the old Soviet empire. At the same time, the regime began using language of restoring traditional values. To Hoveran, the Kremlin strategy seemed all too clear. The Russian government, the Patriarch, and the Russian Orthodox Church would partner to create a spiritual rationale for those policies that might otherwise be unpopular. Those of you who know Soviet history a lot better than I do might see here that what the Soviets tried to do was to repress religion, and what Putin is trying to do, co-opt religion. Though from a very different country with a very different history, the problem of the state and the use of the church showed similarities perhaps to certain elements going on in the United States. We can see clearly why Tim Alberta might include this in his book. Now, once Russia invaded Ukraine full bore, Patriarch Kirill was clearly, by this time, Hoveron had left the Patriarch's employ, but Patriarch Kirill was clearly operating in tandem with Vladimir Putin. Any pretense of church independence was long gone in this effort. The church provided the Russian state and Vladimir Putin with the language of divine destiny to underwrite Mother Russia's historical and religious right to retake what it considered its own. Long gone was the Soviet Union's attempt to relegate the church to the dustbin of history. A personal experience that Julie and I had. In 2017, it was toward the end of Donald Trump's first year in his first presidency. We spent about 3 weeks in Russia. And one of the things we did, we went to a lecture at Moscow State University by a political scientist who had spent a fair bit of time in the US. He had been at, I think, the University of Michigan on sabbatical and so on and so forth. He understood the American system, political system, and there was this lecture on the Russian political system. As with all of these kinds of discussions, you kind of get the formal stuff. You don't get how things really work, but after, this was after Crimea had been taken by the Russians, I had a chance to just ask him a question. And it was, tell me about Crimea then. And this guy's sophisticated and suave, and he said, look, I grew up in Crimea. My dad was an officer in the Soviet Army. And I never heard Ukrainian spoken in Crimea. It was all Russian. Now, I don't think I was over-interpreting the implication of this. It was, these people speak Russian, and many, if not most of them, are ethnically Russian, therefore they are ours. Well, you could go to the Baltic states, you could go to the rest of Ukraine, you could go here and there. There are a lot of ethnic Russians. So, religion is all kind of tied up here. I remember when now the former Pope, Francis, wrote a letter when Ukraine full bore was under assault to the Archbishop of the Russian Orthodox Church, pleading with him to call upon the Russian government to stop. And I remember the reply, I remember there was a reply, and I read it, the reply that Pope Francis got back, which said basically, no. Which would suggest to me that the Russian Orthodox Church and the state were in tandem on this. And it was a cultural identity issue. It wasn't a prophetic Christian idea. I have even seen people who say, and who know a lot about the Russian Orthodox Church, who say, the Russian Orthodox Church is a church, but it ceased to be Christian. Now, that might be easy for those of us sitting outside there to say that. I don't know. But you can see the problem. When we hear the language of America is a Christian nation, I don't know about you, but I get nervous. I don't know if nations can really be Christian at all, but there are a lot of Christians in America, but there are a lot of other religious traditions or no religious traditions in a formal sense. Those of you who know American history better than I do, but I read again, I heard a lecture this winter online by an American historian looking at the colonial period. Church attendance in most of the colonial groups was very low. It was a small fraction, maybe in the teens somewhere. And it didn't really pick up until the First Great Awakening. And then it was juiced again in the Second Great Awakening. So if we look back and think of the United States as a Christian nation from its inception, most of our significant intellectuals were at most, if anything, deists, which simply, the image of the divine watchmaker winds up the watch, puts it in motion, and then goes on vacation. Okay. Sharing the dais at this French meeting with Hoveron at this meeting was Miroslav Volf, a Croatian theologian and thinker who now heads the Yale University Center of Faith and Culture. Now, I know, Steve, you have heard him speak. I've heard him speak. Anybody else heard of this guy? He is I guess he's a Croatian, but he spent his young life, his father was a Pentecostal preacher in this kind of autonomous region in the former Yugoslavia, and it's in the middle of Serbia now, Novi Sad. He grew up there in this evangelical Pentecostal environment. And he became a theologian, studied in this country. He's really quite conservative in many respects, religiously, in his own life. But he is a preeminent theological figure in the West and in the United States right now. He thinks very, very deeply about many of these issues. And Tim Alberta comes in contact with this guy. He reports, Tim Alberta that is, that while a conversation at the conference in France was between two Eastern European scholars, the subtext of the conference was clearly about the American evangelical church. Hoveron, I quote Alberta, Hoveron fought a smirk while describing how Putin manipulated his countrymen into buying a revisionist founding myth of their nation, his ultimate goal being to make Russia great again. Of course, we have no idea what that means, but does the founding myth sound at all familiar? For years, I've driven down the road in Columbia Heights, past the shrine. I guess it's on the south side of the road. I've gotten to the point where I just look the other way now. But the merging of the commandments and worthies from old and the foundation of this country, the merging of all that. I heard a great quip. I don't know how true it is, but no, I do know. It was a Jewish member of Congress Somebody wanted to introduce legislation, I think, in the House, having to do with affirming the Ten Commandments. His stipulation was, and he's Jewish, so the Ten Commandments are part of that world, said, first of all, I'm okay with it if we don't pass them as a set. We take them one at a time. And anybody who has violated that commandment is not allowed to vote. Okay? Huh? Oh, it was Jamie Raskin. That's who it was, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so much for Columbia Heights. For his part, Wolf detailed the ways religion and nationalism are motivating totalitarian movements in many parts of the world today. He said that during his time teaching Christians in America, things had changed. A generation earlier, the militant approach to theology was largely below the surface. That's in this country. But now the American church, broadly speaking, has been captured by nationalist ideals that have saturated the evangelical ecosystem. This Christian nationalism is now, according to Wolf, the predominant form of evangelical Christianity. According to Alberta, Wolf conceded he had no idea what to do about that. This ecosystem is so insular, it is almost impenetrable by outside and contrary realities. Think of the way we access media outlets. And evangelical leaders have too often ceased to be educated, thoughtful leaders and become instead media personalities. Hoveron was asked, according to Alberta, the Russian Orthodox, whether in both Putin's Russia and in Trump's America we are dealing with secular religion. He replied that yes, we are dealing with a similar kind of secular religion. But here, Hoveron wanted to distinguish between civil religion and political religion. Civil religion is practiced voluntarily, whereas political religion is imposed by the state and is not optional. In the United States, he claims that we are still in the civil religion stage, whereas in Russia, things have clearly moved to the political religion stage under Vladimir Putin.
Could you repeat the civil and?
Yes. I can, and I will try to do it as clearly as I know how. Civil religion, political religion. Scholars of American religion have, for a long time, talked about civil religion. The overlap in our civil society, civic society, of largely Christianity. Okay? Hoveron says that's optional. I mean, you know, we kind of fudge it here and there. Political religion is imposed by the state. Might we think of Shia Islam in Iran since the Ayatollah? There is a kind of religious imposition. Am I doing okay here?
Yeah.
Okay. And so, Hoveron says, clearly in Russia, things clearly have moved to the political religion stage under Putin. However, he thinks the United States is not immune from moving to the political religion stage as well. Now that's frightening. What happens when the authorities appear at your door because of something you have posted online? It's already happened. He thinks then, in this country, we're not at the political religion stage, although this could happen in the US of A. I still believe it is possible, unfortunately, he said, and I'm going to conclude with a reading from Alberta here on page 242 of his book. Alberta writes, to the extent Hoveron remained optimistic, it was because of a basic difference between American evangelicalism and Russian Orthodoxy. Political evangelicalism, at least rhetorical, is Christ-centric, he said. Political orthodoxy is not. It avoids speaking about Christ. If you take Putin or others, they don't speak about Christ. They speak about things in the faith. And Wolf wasn't sure that the rhetoric mattered anymore. I've come to believe, says Wolf, that the Christ of the gospel has become a moral stranger to us, he said. If you read the Gospels, the things that profoundly mattered to Christ, they marginally matter to most evangelical Christians. And the things that really profoundly mattered to them marginally mattered to Christ. He added, in the sense in which Christ is the key to Christianity, you cannot have Christianity without Christ. We are, in a certain sense, in this crisis of Christianity precisely because of a certain alienation from Christ. And I could go on, but I won't. Yeah, sure.
Thinking about some of the rhetoric that came out before the election last year, where they interviewed Christian people who said, I recognize that Donald Trump is not a Christian man, but they think he's an agent of God to bring our country to be a Christian nation. I mean, that.
And you know who they point to? Go way back to Cyrus of old in the Old Testament, who freed the Jews from the Babylonian exile. He certainly wasn't a Christian, but he was an agent of God.
I guess, yeah, I don't but
Well,
it's an ends to a mean. I mean, if that's not human secularism, I mean, and he's an ends to their mean, and that's what human secularism is about. It's about, you know, you do whatever you have to do to get what you want in the end, to get the outcome that you want.
yeah.
I mean, or am I wrong? Please correct me.
I wouldn't be the one to object. Linda.
Turn to what I remember about the Old Testament is that the Jews didn't believe, the Jews believed there was one God for them. But they recognized that other nations, other communities had their gods. And the Jewish God was interested in what was good for the Jews. Russian situation you're talking about. The Russians are communicating with, projecting, whatever they do, a God who has their political, their interests, political and otherwise, in mind. And I think in this country, there's that same, am I?
No, let me see if I just can verbalize it myself. About, Linda was saying that if you go back into the Old Testament, let's say the earliest period of the Hebrews and the Israelite kingdom, and with the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, the beginning of what we call early Judaism, and then on down the pike. We, I think, mistakenly think that, and this is related to what you're saying, the Jews, Israelites, Hebrews, from beginning to end, were always monotheistic. There is one God and only one God anywhere. I don't think that's accurate. At best, there was an evolutionary process in their thinking about one God as opposed to many gods, but they lived in a complex part of the world in those days, as it is today, and they worshiped this God, and sometimes they were overrun by other peoples and their gods and so on and so forth. But probably in about a 50-year period, when Jerusalem was overrun and the exiles were taken off to Babylon, into the Mediterranean, to the Mesopotamian region, they had to figure out what it meant to be Jews in a world that wasn't theirs to control. And it is probably at that time that they assembled much of what we would consider the Old Testament today. And Cyrus comes along and he allows them to go back to their land, and the temple is rebuilt and so on and so forth. But they're living in a pluralistic world, and they're trying to figure this out. Well, folks, we live in a pluralistic religious world too. Now, that doesn't mean that the Israelites and Jews of old sort of sacrificed their traditions and their convictions, theological and otherwise, and just said, well, let's boil this whole big pot down and we'll just kind of see what's left, and we'll all subscribe to this in a kind of a universalism. They didn't do that. And if you just take my position, I don't think that's what we should do either in the 21st century. We should be, if we were to do that and try to do that, you know, our problem is we can't deal with difference. We want to boil it down. We need to learn how to live constructively with difference and still maintain some sense of the, I don't like this word, but the most noble virtues of our own traditions. And so you can get rabbis and you can get imams and Hindus and Buddhists together and all be their own thing, but learn from each other, converse with each other, and come away from those conversations better than they went in. As Christians, as Jews, as whatever. So, and I've worked mostly with the three big monotheistic religions of the Middle East. And there are some things we have in common in terms of our structural understanding of religion. All the particulars may be at variance in some respects, but structurally, we have a lot that we share. And we ought to share it. Am I dealing with your...
But it is human nature. When I want to be right.
to hunker down?
Yeah, and to, want my God to look, to validate me. It's not just the preacher I want to validate. I want my, whatever I project.
No, I think two things are in play here. One is what Sherry said earlier. We come into our own religious communities, church communities, whatever they might, because there is something that's familiar and similar and reflects our values and all of this. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But on the other hand, if we want to close that off, we want to close those doors, or the doors of any church. Fire marshal wouldn't let us lock them, I'm sure, but they become not bridges to the world, but boundaries, fences. Not just against other people, but against other ideas, other theologies, other ways of standing under some kind of critique. I don't think the Lutheran Church, I don't think the Episcopal Church, I don't think the Catholic Church, I don't think the Methodist Church, Congregational Church, any church, evangelical church, it ought to be beyond critique. Reflective critique. Offered in love and empathy and compassion and concern, all those things. So here's my problem is, I'm going to agree with both of you. Not really a problem. I think in a complex world, that's the way it does and should work.
And it seems to me that right now is a really opportune moment and a clarifying moment for the church to speak about what you said earlier, growing up being told that the source of evil was within you, and not hearing that you were made in the image of God. And to listen to Pope Leo these last several days talk about what it is to be a Christ follower, and then to cast our eyes into the Middle East and see what's happening there, and in our own selves, our own desire for power and wealth and whatever else. Having Christ at the center of it is really the heart of the matter.
For those of us who are in this religious tradition, it is. I would not want to turn America into a cross-carrying charge into the Middle East or any other part of the world. Mike? Mike first and then Craig.
Well, I guess what you have to say really about the last few days. And I keep thinking,
Mike is talking here about the last few days, I assume the Pope business.
Leo, and the following of Pope Francis.
Mm-hmm.
And this, bringing America into this, where we're made up of many religions, many countries. With time, is it possible focus is from the political.
We always hope. I mean, I think historically that has been the case, hasn't it? That the political pendulum.
Yeah, but the other thing that I keep wanting to know, or it goes through my mind now, is what is the status of the Pope in the world today of religion? From what I remember when I was growing up. And is there value to parts of the country here? Do they really know what Pope is, or do they really focus on?
Well, I mean, I think the Catholic community clearly understands. And most of us who are not Catholic, we have some ideas because we have Catholic family members and friends. And once upon a time, I sat in that square for an open-air audience with Pope John Paul II, and I'll tell you, you can take the most dog-bitten Protestant you'd find, and you have tears and, and you have shivers running up and down your back. Or when the Pope gets up and speaks, what is it, at New Year's? Urbi et orbi, to the city and the world. You know, I mean, there is tradition here. So we do know some things. I think, if you're like me, I'll just say for myself here. I'm comfortable with the tradition in which I am found. Pope Leo the 14th, is an Augustinian monk. I read in the New York Times today there are 3,000 Augustinians worldwide. Why might that be a connection to Lutherans? Luther was an Augustinian monk. And I would like to see my own, if I go back far enough, roots in that whole business. And I have written extensively on the first 2 centuries of the post-New Testament church. And that's where that church was born. And I feel it's an obligation not to pretend like I'm a Roman Catholic today, but to stand up to my knees in that tradition. Craig.
No, 20 years ago, I had the privilege of, in my last job in the Navy, of overseeing the Navy's chaplain school. And I would sit in on their instruction, which included they had to be exposed to every religion, because every service man and woman may not have a, practice a religion that wasn't necessarily a Southern Baptist, a Lutheran, a Catholic, a rabbi. So they had to learn about all these different religions. I had the privilege of sitting in on, discussions and questions about their different religions. And it, what the takeaway for me is we are a very blended society. But, probably the big takeaway was 99% of every religion practices the golden rule. Okay, that's kind of a thread that's woven amongst all religions. So
No, that's,
we are very blended, and we have to respect, and that's what these chaplains have to do, is they go out and serve in our military. They have an obligation to their faith and their country, and to make sure that servicemen and women and their families can practice the faith that they enjoy.
Yeah. Could everybody more or less hear Craig? Yeah.
That's one of the things that Rabbi Francine pointed out in her presentation, is when she went through all, not just monotheistic religions of the world, but the Hinduism and Buddhism and all of them, and they love your neighbor, and what does that mean in their religion and in their faith, and it was a common thread.
There are those common threads, and I think they should be held up for all to see. Mike?
Well, that's really, you know, the Dalai Lama and Bishop Desmond Tutu befriended each other and came very close and then wrote a book together. And, you know, it was the common ground that really brought them together.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This is going to be a downer. Would you like to know what evangelicals think and say on the internet spheres? Because a new pope has been crowned, but the old lie remains. No priest, no pontiff, no pope can save you. Salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, according to Scripture alone, for the glory of God alone. Flee false shepherds and run to Christ.
That assumes something. Namely, it assumes, if I'm hearing this correctly, that the Pope, this Pope, the previous Pope, previous Pope, thinks that they are the Savior.
And it assumes in a deeply reformed tradition that anything Catholic is
Bad.
bad.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's so hard for me to understand, sorry. It's so hard for me to understand if one listened to what this new pope spoke on that balcony and all of the other things that are being shared about his life, that one would not see something there that is so antithetical to what you've just described.
But that's part of what's happening in these extreme churches and this insulated in-house atmosphere where you don't let your people hear this stuff, and you don't let them have discussions about how this could be valid. I mean, we can sit here and discuss this, but you can bet these kind of conversations aren't going on in the
Sure,
evangelical
sure.
churches around.
And if we're honest about the history of the last 500 years, we know that there's been a lot of anti-Catholicism and anti-Protestantism that's played out in more than a couple of wars, religious wars.
Even within the founding of the United States in many ways.
Struggles.
That's usually the tensions and what all the wars and conflict that are going on over our globe are tied to religious beliefs and differences.
Yeah, yeah, they often are. I would say, though, not always. I mean, I think the 20th century is an exception to that. You have ideology, nationalism, and Marxist-Leninism, and Maoism, and whatever the other ism. But you're right. And part of religion's dilemma is it's so expansive, it creeps into so many parts of our life that it gets interwoven with all the political and social dynamics. And they become religious wars. Yeah.
When we heard the title of your talk over the 4 weeks, it had the word heresy in it. Is that something that comes from Tim Alberta's book, which I have not finished?
No, it comes from me.
Good. I'm coming for the next class to hear more about that.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to answer that. No, it's more of a conceptual thing. As I have sometimes said, it's not a word we generally hear much of in the contemporary situation.
Right.
And among academics of religion, you almost never hear that word because we don't want to be judgmental. The only reason I chose, after some deliberation, to use the word is if there isn't a singular truth, the question then arises, is there any truth at all? And you get, if you say there isn't any truth, and this is kind of a scholastic academic argument, in the postmodern world, many philosophers of religion and theologians have given up on the idea of truth. I would not be among them, for the reason that while I think pluralism and difference is to be celebrated, if we aren't careful, sneaking through the back door can be a kind of relativism where there is no truth and you have no ability, because you have no yardstick to judge things that are better or not. And authoritarianism can creep in the back door because you can't critique it. You have no basis upon which to critique it. And lo and behold, here you are. The only thing that matters is who has the power. And I don't want to go there, frankly. So, if I'm not prepared to abandon the whole notion of truth, I am not entirely prepared to abandon the whole notion of orthodoxy versus heresy. I think there are some things that are heterodox, are wrong.
So what is it in this case? I mean, if it's,
Jumping to the end.
yeah, if it's Arius, I can tell you where he went off the rails.
Yeah, right, yeah. Those kinds of arguments are part of the history of the church, but they are not immediately relevant for most of us. When people do not build a bridge to people who are different from ourselves, that's a problem. I think it is a problem as well when we don't take seriously, not only in our heads, but in our hearts and our limbs, the example of Jesus. Do it to the least of them, you've done it to me. I think that is heresy. If you don't like the word, you can not use it and still accept it.
We
We
kick him
liked it,
because of
we
it,
liked
yes.
Yeah. You know, I've taught a lot of undergraduates who went to a denominationally affiliated institution. And I've had a lot of students who would write evaluations. And then I lived through the period when they could put them online. And I knew what I was going to get online. You either get those who love you or hate you. There's nothing in between. But there would be evaluations that would start out, you know, this guy is supposed to be a Christian. This guy is supposed to even be ordained. But can you imagine what he has taught us? They considered a whole lot of what I was challenging them to think about as heretical. They thought it was beyond. It was only heretical based upon their circumscribed view of what Christianity was about, I think. See, maybe you've run into that kind of stuff too, where I didn't really know what to do about that, but it's a reality, I think, that young people who are going through those traditional college-age years are dealing with a world that is opening up in ways that they need to have happen, and they need to be able to deal with it. if they couldn't deal with me, what are they going to how are they going to deal with other issues out and about? And I would tell them right up front, ad nauseum, look, if this course ends and you end up thinking just like I do, it's been a failure for me and for you. But if you end this class with an ability to think critically about these issues, I can't ask for anything more, even if it's contrary to what I... and then they would come back and they'd say, well, okay, what is an idea here that would be beyond the pale? And I wouldn't use the word heresy, but it would be beyond the pale. I'd say, okay, if you think that the Jews killed Jesus and are guilty for all times because of that, for the death of God, I'm sorry, I take exception. I not only think you're wrong, but I think you're dangerous. David?
In your work in the first 2 centuries, which was revelatory of all the vast diversity, it's comparable to my brain as the diversity within the Christian community in 21st century America. And my understanding of that word heresy, it particularly means choice. And as the church world worked itself out, there were good choices and bad choices, which then a bad choice might become heretical, but it was all within a dialogue, a conversation.
And it would get heated.
Yeah. And perhaps violent. But,
Yeah.
And one of them, I'm endeared to the heretical conversation between Augustine and Pelagius. In a nutshell.
Are you all familiar with St. Augustine? How about Pelagius? Well,
it's just in a very narrow point of view, it is the difference between do we believe in original sin or original blessing. And there's much more to it, of course, as you know, but that worked itself out in that long-term dialogue between those 2 church leaders.
oh, I think so. And it goes right back to that 4th century, 5th century kind of world in the church where they're trying to sort out, I suppose, leaning on the Augustinian side, not only sin, but original sin, ubiquitous sin. We are born and conceived in sin. And the blessing, the original blessing. Read, Genesis 1 and all of that. So, where do you come down on that? And how do you imagine all of that constructively in human existence? Yeah.
Is it a heresy?
Just a second. It is 5 minutes after 7. You are free to go anytime you want. But I'm having fun, so.
Is it a heresy to say we are a Christian nation in order to protect our borders? We will separate children from their parents at the border to act as a deterrent for people to try and enter our country.
Well, I know my answer to that, but you can. Yeah.
I can't claim to be a Christian nation.
No, that's another example of the human secularism. You're having ends to a means. You're putting from my perspective, you're putting a punishment or an anti-incentive, whatever you want to call it, on the people not to come.
Yeah. I grew up in a family in a world where you do everything possible to protect the children, first of all. Everybody but the children, for goodness sakes. Protect the children. And I grew up in a world where the goal was not to just scare the hell out of people.
And not to squash them with original sin and lowly worm theology that we talk about.
Well, I'll tell you, when I was serving a church, I was an associate pastor, and there was a church down the street, not far away, and I will not name the denomination of that church, but they were a two-point parish, and way out in the boondocks, there was a church in that two-point parish. And they asked us at our church if I could come and conduct services at those two-point parishes. And the first one was the rural, way out in the boondocks. And I was interviewed by the neighboring pastor to see if I would qualify or whatever. And I went there on a Sunday morning early, and I looked at the confession of sin language. And I thought, I don't know if I can say this. I mean, you would be hard-pressed to walk out of there without feeling like a lowly worm. That wasn't my experience. I don't know what, I suppose I said it and crossed my fingers behind my back. I don't know what I did, but it was frightening language. Now, I can only imagine what happens when that's all you hear and have heard and will hear. What about the original blessing? Okay. Huh?
I said you were doomed to hell.
Well,
I'm sorry, I just.
folks, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Well,
I used to have the chaplain service at the VA in San Diego report to me. So the chief of chaplains and I met monthly and for a couple hours and had really